Dark forests, forgotten rituals, and the primal fear of the unknown. This is folk horror, a subgenre that taps into our deepest cultural myths and ancient fears. The definition of the folk horror subgenre is as atmospheric and amorphous as most movies that we would consider folk horror are. So today we're exploring where this subgenre came from, talking about the tropes within this subgenre, and of course I will give you recommendations for some horror movies and books that are folk horror. While the heyday of folk horror is considered to be settled in certain British horror films of the late 60s and early 70s, the groundwork was being laid for folk horror as far back as 1922 with the release of Häxan, which depicted the dark history of witchcraft. But it wasn't until the release of certain 3 films known as the Unholy Trinity that folk horror really came into its own. Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man truly define the subgenre and reflect a societal disillusionment with back to the land ideals of a post-hippie generation. These 3 movies in particular showcase the horrors of isolated rural communities. As such, a lot of what we consider folk horror remind audiences of where we came from, the rural landscapes where old traditions still hold incredible power. And many fans agree that the landscape of a folk horror movie is an integral part of what defines a folk horror movie. In fact, it's often noted that the landscape in these movies are a character in and of themselves. Remote, untamed, undeveloped areas where civilization's rules no longer apply. The catalyst in these movies are typically a character or a couple or a group of friends that decide to vacation in these remote places or move to these remote places, hoping to get away from the hustle and bustle of the modern world. Either that, or they are actively investigating a piece of lore or legend that leads them to the countryside, where they learn why certain things should remain undisturbed. But folk horror is way more than just city folk traveling to these rural, isolated places. It can also be the bringing of quote-unquote old ways into urban settings, taking over modern ways of life. I feel like these types of folk horror movies in particular are really scary because it reminds us that the remnants of these old practices and legends are with us no matter where we are as a society, for one, and for another thing, that eventually, as every little bit of land is developed, the quote-unquote old ways, these old gods, these old legends will be forcibly integrated into the modern world, and I doubt they'll be happy about that. As technology progresses and we become more and more reliant on the amenities of the modern world, I think folk horror as a subgenre is only going to continue to grow, especially with the rise of social media. And not to sound like a boomer, but in so many ways we've become more and more disconnected with each other outside of our phones. And we're already seeing some folk horror movies come out of a reaction to this, a desire to return to a society with real human connection. And this is one of my favorite horror subgenres ever because of that like rawness and realness. Like, these aren't just ghosts or monsters. It's about forgotten traditions, old gods, things that sometimes are based in truth. Certainly movies hyperbolize and take liberties, but humans have been around a long time, and sometimes these old ways can be frightening, or they can be dangerous if you disrespect them. Okay, so now for some recommendations. If you want to see a list of the folk horror movies that I've seen, that I can remember that I've seen, this list will probably be ongoing. You can check out my Letterboxd. I have a list of a bunch of ranked folk horror movies. If you go to check out that list, I just need to give you a disclaimer that it was really hard to rank those. Like, I realized how much I really love this subgenre when it came time to deciding which ones I liked the best. Just consider like the first 20 all in the #1 spot. But for some more specific folk horror recommendations, so out of the Unholy Trinity that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, my absolute favorite is The Wicker Man. It's the most quintessential out of the 3, and it follows the structure most people think of when they think of a folk horror movie, in my opinion. So if you're looking for a real good, just a perfect example of like the structure of a traditional folk horror movie, The Wicker Man is it. Now, my favorite folk horror movie that came out this year, 2024, is Exuma, which is a South Korean horror movie. I like this one because it takes a slightly different angle. I think a basic folk horror rendition of this movie would be following the point of view of the family that messes with the wrong stuff and is now haunted and it has to seek help. But instead, the movie follows shamans that are trying to solve the family's problem. It raises the stakes to have characters experienced in these old ways and find out that even they are being challenged, and it's not so easy for them to deal with this thing. And my last two specific folk horror movie recommendations are ones that I think are underrated. Very underrated. So one that I really like is Incantation, which is a Taiwanese found footage horror movie that came out in 2022, I think. This one has a really interesting blend of the old and the new that you would expect to find in a folk horror movie, but there is a viral twist that makes this one a really interesting watch in the internet age that not a lot of folk horror movies have really explored yet. And my last movie recommendation, another kind of underrated one, is Pyewacket. I like this one because it is the perfect example of old gods being brought into the modern world by somebody who doesn't fully understand what they're getting themselves into, which is another common trope of folk horror movies. This one feels especially poignant given the rise of pagan religions in recent years, paired with social media. Like, the amount of misinformation floating around is insane, and I think Pyewacket kind of picks up on that almost ahead of its time a little bit. And of course, I'm gonna give you some book recommendations as well for my book nerds out there. The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones is easily one of my all-time favorite horror books probably ever, and definitely my favorite folk horror book. And I had to make sure I had at least one recommendation to rep North American folk horror, which normally would kind of be like your Poltergeist-esque stories, right? Like this idea of something built on an Indian burial ground, which is just the entirety of the United States. It's all a Indian burial ground. And then that thing that was built on there being cursed or haunted. I love the twist that Stephen Graham Jones takes on that kind of story, and it's a perspective that's not really explored in this subgenre. My next recommendation is another one that cleverly uses modern technology in relation to this idea of like old powers or old gods, and that is Hex by Thomas Old Hoyveld. This is a really unique story of the aforementioned like old powers kind of being linked to the land, and it ends up permeating this town that looks very normal on the outside, and it looks modern and it looks inviting, and that's why it's so insidious and scary. Of course, I have to recommend a classic, and that would be The Lottery by Shirley Jackson for me. Super easy to read, super quick read if you haven't before. And this one's another great example of like an otherwise like modern, for the time it was written, town, holding on to an archaic practice to ensure a good harvest. There's something very pagan about that story that I really like as well. And finally, had to throw in a graphic novel recommendation. Through the Woods by Emily Carroll is a short anthology of folk horror stories, kind of in their purest form. Like, as the title suggests, the stories cover the horror of the deep, dark woods, those isolated places that the modern world has more or less forgotten about. All right, now it is your turn. Let me know in the comments what your favorite folk horror movies and books are, and let me know what other horror subgenres you'd like me to cover in future videos. I will see you soon with a new video. Thank you for your patience on my lack of uploads this month. Hurricane Milton really was out to ruin my spooky time, and I'm gonna try and get it back this last like 2 weeks of October that we have. So I hope you're having a lovely day and a lovely week. I will see you very soon right here on this channel. Until then, stay strange. Bye.